There is a moment in the very first episode of Friends that everyone remembers as a punchline. Almost nobody remembers it as the most honest thing Rachel Green ever said on that entire show. She is sitting in a wedding dress, soaking wet, trying to explain to her father over the phone why she just left her own wedding. And she says something strange. She says her whole life everyone kept telling her she was a shoe, and today she suddenly thought, what if she did not want to be a shoe? What if she wanted to be a purse or a hat? Everyone watching laughs. It is a ridiculous, very 1990s line delivered by a sobbing woman in soaked taffeta. But underneath that joke is the entire engine of who Rachel Green actually was for 10 straight years. Because that line was never really about shoes. It was about a woman who had just realized at the altar that an entire life had already been picked out for her before she ever got a say in it. And she ran. Most people remember Rachel as the spoiled one, the shallow one, the pretty, slightly self-absorbed friend who eventually grew into a confident career woman. And that arc is real. It is genuinely one of the best character transformations the show ever pulled off. But I do not think that transformation is the real story. I think Rachel spent her entire life running from something specific, something that had nothing to do with Barry or weddings or even Ross. I think she was running from the terrifying possibility of becoming exactly the woman her mother had already become. And once you see that, her entire arc on this show plays completely differently. I am genuinely curious what you think before we get any further into this whole theory, so stick with me for a moment here. Do you see Rachel as simply the spoiled one who grew up? Or do you think there was something heavier driving the whole journey? Let me know down in the comments below. I really genuinely want to hear your own honest take on all of this. Let us go back to that wedding dress because almost nobody actually examines what Rachel was running from in the literal sense. She was not simply nervous. She was not having ordinary cold feet, the kind people joke about at every wedding. She tells her father in that very first episode that her entire life people had decided who she was going to be. Pretty, decorative, eventually married to someone successful, living a comfortable life that required no real effort or risk on her part whatsoever. Barry himself was never really a mistake. Barry was the plan working exactly as designed. Wealthy, respectable, an orthodontist with a stable income, and absolutely no surprises attached to him at all. By every external measure available to her, marrying Barry was Rachel succeeding at the only project anyone had ever actually handed her. Becoming a wife, becoming eventually someone's mother, becoming in the end a slightly younger copy of Sandra Green. If you genuinely enjoy these deep character breakdowns, the small things most fans completely miss, make sure you go ahead and subscribe. There are many more videos exactly like this one coming soon, and I think you will really enjoy them. And that comparison matters enormously because Rachel's mother is one of the most quietly revealing details in this entire story. Sandra Green appears only a handful of times across the whole show, but every single time she does, the show gives us a glimpse of exactly what Rachel was terrified of becoming. Sandra is wealthy, comfortable, and visibly unhappy in ways she has clearly spent decades not examining too closely. When she eventually announces she is leaving Rachel's father, the explanation she gives is almost unbearably simple. She realized she had built her entire identity around being someone's wife, and she no longer knew who she was without that role attached to her. Think about how devastating that detail actually is, sitting quietly in the background of an otherwise comedic show. Rachel's own mother, late in her own life, finally discovers something painful. An entire existence built around being chosen by a man leaves a person with almost nothing solid left, nothing standing once that role disappears. Rachel watched that. Rachel absorbed that, long before she consciously understood what she was absorbing, and on some level deeper than she could have articulated standing at that altar, Rachel understood something. Marrying Barry meant signing up to become exactly that. A woman whose entire identity depended on someone else's choosing of her, with nothing of her own underneath it to fall back on. That is what she actually ran from. Not Barry specifically. The entire blueprint Barry represented. But that is not even the strangest part. The strangest part is what happens immediately after she runs, because the running does not actually stop. It just changes shape. Watch Rachel in those very first episodes, fresh off the plane of her old life. Suddenly responsible for her own existence, for what appears to be the very first time. She cannot do basic things. She does not understand how paychecks work. She cuts up her father's credit cards in a dramatic show of independence, and then immediately panics about how she is supposed to actually survive without them. This gets played quite correctly for comedy episode after episode in those very early seasons. It is genuinely funny watching a grown woman discover that coffee does not, in fact, grow already prepared inside a pot. But underneath the comedy is something worth taking seriously. Rachel did not just leave a wedding. She left the only identity she had ever actually been given, and she had absolutely nothing prepared to replace it with. That gap between the life she fled and the life she had not yet built is where the real story of Rachel Green actually lives. And then I noticed something that almost nobody really talks about. Something that connects every single relationship Rachel has across the entire run of the show. Look at the pattern of men Rachel actually pursues, especially in the earlier seasons before her career fully takes shape. Paolo, the charming, useless Italian who offers nothing except physical attraction and zero actual substance. Russ, a man so interchangeable with Ross that the joke practically writes itself. A string of men who offer excitement, comfort, or distraction. Rarely anything resembling the kind of partnership that requires Rachel to build something alongside another adult, rather than simply orbiting around them. This is not really a moral failing on her part at all. It is, more accurately, a survival strategy, carefully if unconsciously constructed. A woman who just barely escaped becoming permanently defined by one man's choice of her is, quite understandably, deeply terrified. Genuinely terrified of accidentally walking right back into that exact same trap all over again. So she keeps things light. She keeps things temporary. She keeps moving, relationship to relationship. The same restless momentum that carried her out of that wedding dress, just redirected into smaller, more frequent escapes. This is the wound underneath the wound. It was never really about any specific man failing her. It was about Rachel being terrified that any sufficiently serious relationship would eventually swallow her whole. The exact same way she watched it happen to her own mother. Before we get to the career, it is worth pausing on Rachel's father. The show does something with him late in the run that complicates the entire picture. For most of the series, Leonard Green is presented as exactly what you would expect. Stern, intimidating. The source of the credit cards Rachel dramatically severs herself from in the pilot. A man who clearly views his daughter's independence with some combination of confusion and mild disapproval. But there is a later episode where something genuinely surprising happens. Rachel discovers, almost by accident, that her father has actually been quietly proud of her this entire time. Proud specifically of the independent life she built without his money, the very thing she assumed he resented her for pursuing. That detail recontextualizes everything that came before it. Rachel spent years assuming her father's silence meant disapproval, the same way she once assumed her value depended on fulfilling one narrow version of what a daughter was supposed to become. And the entire time, the actual verdict waiting underneath that silence was something closer to admiration. That is, in its own quiet way, almost as sad as if the disapproval had been real. Because it means Rachel spent years running from a fear that was not even accurate. She built an entire defensive identity in response to a judgment. A judgment that, underneath the surface, had never actually been rendered against her in the way she assumed. Now look at her career, because this is where the running finally starts to turn into something else entirely. Rachel's first job is humiliating by her own previous standards. Waitressing at a coffee shop, fumbling orders, completely unprepared for actual labor of any kind. And the show does not rush her past that humiliation. It sits in it, season after season, letting Rachel actually struggle in a way her old life had never once required of her. But watch what happens slowly underneath that struggle. She does not quit. She does not call her father and ask to be rescued, even when rescue is sitting right there, one phone call away, the entire time. She keeps working terrible, unglamorous jobs in fashion, the industry she actually cares about. Taking pay cuts, demotions, and humiliations that would have been unthinkable for the woman who walked into Central Perk in that wedding dress. That persistence is not nothing. For a woman raised entirely to be chosen rather than to build, choosing to build something slowly and painfully on her own is enormous, even though the show frames most of it as comedy. Here is the contradiction sitting at the very center of Rachel Green. A woman who spent her whole childhood being told her only job was to be wanted. She slowly discovers the thing she actually wants most is to be capable. Those two identities do not coexist easily, and watching Rachel try to hold both of them at once, often clumsily, often contradicting herself within the same episode, is genuinely remarkable. One of the most honest character arcs the show ever attempted. It is also worth pausing here on something that rarely gets discussed in relation to Rachel specifically. The role this new friend group actually played in her transformation. Rachel did not just leave a wedding. She left an entire social world built around a specific kind of woman. the kind her mother was, the kind her old friends from that life almost certainly were too. And in its place, she found herself surrounded by people who had absolutely no investment in keeping her small, decorative, or easy to predict. Watch how the group treats Rachel in those early episodes. Monica does not coddle her. Chandler teases her relentlessly about her old life, refusing to let her quietly slide back into old patterns of entitlement. Phoebe, in her own strange way, treats Rachel as a fully formed equal from the very first conversation, never once deferring to the version of status Rachel had relied on her whole life. That matters enormously because a person does not actually unlearn an identity alone. They unlearn it in relationship to people who refuse to keep confirming the old story. Rachel's friends, almost without realizing it, became the first people in her life who related to her as someone capable, rather than someone simply decorative or amusing, and being treated that way consistently over years eventually started to change how Rachel related to herself. This is not a small detail tucked into the corner of the show. It is, in many ways, the actual mechanism behind her transformation. Rachel did not simply will herself into becoming independent through sheer personal effort. She became independent partly because she was finally surrounded by people who treated independence as the obvious baseline expectation, not as some impressive exception to be marveled at. And then there is Ross, the relationship most people remember as the central romance of the entire show. I think it actually reveals the running pattern more clearly than almost anything else in Rachel's story. Think about the timing of when Rachel and Ross actually get together. It happens only after Rachel has started building something of her own, started working, started becoming a person with an identity that exists independently of being chosen by someone. And Ross, almost immediately, begins struggling with that independence in ways that genuinely threaten the relationship. Watch Ross's reaction to Rachel's growing career, especially in the later seasons. He resents her hours. He resents her ambition. He makes a list weighing her professional drive as a literal negative quality, evidence against her, the way you might list a flaw in a person you are deciding whether to keep. And here is what is fascinating about Rachel's response to that pressure. She does not collapse back into the old pattern. She does not simply abandon the career to keep the relationship intact, the way old Rachel, wedding dress Rachel, almost certainly would have done without a second thought. She pushes back. She fights for the thing she built. And when the relationship cannot survive that fight, she lets the relationship go rather than abandoning herself all over again. That is the turning point. Not a single dramatic scene, a sustained, repeated choice across multiple seasons to no longer be the woman who disappears into someone else's plan for her life. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth examining before we get to the ending. It might be the single clearest test of how far Rachel had actually come. Her pregnancy with Emma arrives unexpectedly, the result of one night with Ross during yet another stretch when they are not technically together. Rachel's entire early arc was built around the terror of becoming defined by domestic roles she never chose. Motherhood should, by every logical expectation, have triggered the exact same panic that sent her running from that altar. It does not happen that way. Watch how Rachel handles the pregnancy across that final stretch of seasons. She is frightened, certainly, and the show never pretends otherwise. But she does not disappear into the role the way her own mother seemingly had. She keeps working, often visibly pregnant in rooms full of executives who clearly were not expecting to negotiate with a woman in that condition. She refuses to let motherhood become the single defining fact that erases everything else she had built. That refusal is enormous, and it rarely gets discussed as the significant character beat that it actually is. A woman raised to believe her value would be reduced down to wife and mother gets the chance to test that exact fear directly, and instead of disappearing into it the way she always feared she would, she builds a third identity alongside the other two. Mother, partner, eventually, and, just as importantly, herself. That is not a small accomplishment for a woman taught, her whole childhood, that those identities were supposed to replace a person entirely, rather than simply add to who they already were. And this brings us to the moment that I think is actually the emotional center of her entire 10-year arc. Most people remember it as a simple romantic conclusion, rather than the complicated thing it actually is, the Paris job. By the time this offer arrives, late in the final season, Rachel has built something genuinely remarkable from absolutely nothing. She started as a woman who did not understand how a paycheck worked. She ends as a woman being offered an executive position at one of the most prestigious fashion houses in the world, entirely because of work she did herself, with nobody handing it to her, and Ross, predictably, panics. He tries to manipulate her former employer into offering her a counteroffer, one specifically designed to keep her in New York, near him, rather than supporting the things she actually built. It is in many ways the oldest pattern in her entire life playing out one more time. A man attempting to redirect Rachel's trajectory according to what he needs from her, rather than what she actually wants for herself. She gets on that plane anyway, ticket in hand, ready to go. Nothing standing between her and the new life waiting on the other side of that flight. That single choice, easy to skim past in the rush toward the finale's romantic ending, is enormous. The woman who once could not survive without her father's credit cards is now willing to walk away from the man she loves most, rather than abandon something she built entirely on her own. That is not the old Rachel anymore. That is the entire arc completed, right there on that runway. It is worth revisiting the break itself here too, specifically from Rachel's side of it, since most retellings of that story focus almost entirely on Ross. Rachel asks for space, not an ending during a period when Ross's jealousy and possessiveness had become genuinely suffocating to live inside. And what is remarkable, looking back at that moment with everything we now understand about Rachel's deeper fears, is what she was actually asking for. Not freedom from Ross specifically, freedom from being managed, freedom from having her time, her friendships, her career ambitions treated as threats to be monitored and controlled by someone else. That request, on its own, is the voice of a woman already becoming someone fundamentally different from the girl in the wedding dress. The old Rachel would have simply absorbed the possessiveness, the way she had been trained her whole life to absorb whatever a man required of her in exchange for being chosen. This Rachel asks for room to breathe instead. Ross responds to that request by sleeping with someone else the same night. He spends years insisting the relationship was technically over at that exact moment. And something important happens to Rachel that rarely gets framed correctly. She does not simply forgive him because the show needs them back together eventually. She holds a boundary, repeatedly, refusing to simply accept his version of events as the official one. That refusal to simply accept someone else's narrative about her own life is, quietly, one of the most significant developments in her entire arc. The woman who once let an entire wedding get planned around her without objecting is by this point willing to insist on something. That her own account of what happened matters just as much as his does, and then of course she gets off the plane. This is where the show's ending gets genuinely complicated, and where I think most people's reading of it misses something important. Because on the surface, Rachel getting off that plane looks like exactly the old pattern resurfacing. The woman choosing love over independence, choosing to be chosen rather than choosing herself. Exactly the trap she spent the entire show running from in the first place, but I do not think that is quite what is actually happening in that scene, if you watch it carefully enough. Old Rachel, wedding dress Rachel, ran from a life because it was simply handed to her, without her ever actually being consulted about whether she wanted it. The Rachel standing on that plane has spent 10 years building an entire identity independent of anyone else's plan for her. She has already proven repeatedly that she can choose herself. The choice to get off that plane is not a retreat from independence. It is the first time in the entire show that Rachel makes a major life decision from a position of genuine strength, rather than fear. She is not running anymore. For the first time in this entire story, she is simply choosing. Think about how rare that distinction actually is, even outside the world of this particular show. Most people spend significant portions of their lives reacting to fear, rather than acting from genuine desire. The two can look almost identical from the outside. A person leaving a job might be escaping something unbearable, or they might be moving freely towards something better. A person ending a relationship might be running from intimacy, or they might simply have realized calmly and clearly that it is not what they want anymore. The actions themselves rarely announce which version is actually happening underneath them. Rachel's entire decade gives us the rare privilege of watching both versions happen to the same person, years apart. The contrast becomes impossible to miss if you're paying attention. The wedding dress is fear, dressed up as decisiveness. The airport is decisiveness, finally arriving without fear attached to it at all. That distinction matters enormously, even if the show never explicitly states it out loud. A woman who runs from her own wedding, terrified of disappearing into someone else's plan, is different. She's not the same woman who walks away from a career opportunity 10 years later. Not when nothing is forcing her hand. Not when she has simply decided freely that this man and this life are what she actually wants. One is escape, the other is choice. And the entire emotional weight of Rachel Green's 10-year journey depends on understanding the difference between those two things. And one more detail worth noticing, because it ties the whole arc together in a way that is easy to miss on a casual rewatch. Notice that Rachel does not get off that plane in a panic. Not the way she ran out of her wedding, soaked and barefoot and half out of her mind. She has time on that flight to actually sit with the decision. She thinks it through. She makes a choice deliberately, with her eyes fully open, rather than acting purely on instinct, the way she did the very first time we ever met her. That difference in pacing alone tells you almost everything you need to know about how far she had actually traveled. The woman in the wedding dress could only run. The woman on that plane could finally choose calmly, on her own terms, exactly how her own story was going to end. Think about what it actually took to get there. A childhood spent being told her only real value was being chosen, the way a shoe is chosen off a shelf. A mother who modeled exactly what happens to a woman whose entire identity collapses the moment the role of wife disappears. A series of shallow, low-stakes relationships designed specifically to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of actually being seen. Chosen for who she really was, underneath the surface. Years of humiliating, unglamorous labor, slowly building something nobody could simply hand to her or take away from her either. That is the real story hiding underneath every joke about Rachel's shopping habits and every flashback to her spoiled younger self. A woman who had to learn the hard way across an entire decade that running and choosing are not the same motion, even though from a distance they can look remarkably similar. She ran once before, out of pure terror in a wedding dress toward a life she had not yet built. And she ran one more time, years later, off an airplane, toward a life she had already built entirely on her own, simply because she finally wanted to. That is who Rachel Green actually was, underneath the hair and the shopping bags and the running joke about her early incompetence in the workplace. Not simply the spoiled one who eventually grew up, a woman who spent her entire adult life carefully, painfully, unlearning the idea that her only real value was being picked. And by the very end, she had built something nobody could take from her. Not the way Barry's ring or her father's money once could be. Something entirely her own that is not a small transformation. For a woman raised the exact way Rachel was raised, that might be one of the hardest things a person ever learns to do. And here is something worth sitting with, because it complicates the simple version of this story in a way that actually matters. Rachel's arc was never a clean, linear march from dependence to independence. It zigzagged constantly. She regressed repeatedly into old patterns whenever fear got loud enough. She let Ross back in more times than the running pattern alone would predict. She occasionally, even late into the show, reached for the comfort of being chosen rather than doing the harder work of choosing. That inconsistency is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is, if anything, the most honest part of the entire arc. Real change rarely happens in one clean line. It happens in fits and starts, with old fears resurfacing exactly when you thought you had outgrown them. The same lesson gets relearned in a slightly different form each time. Rachel had to learn the difference between running and choosing more than once across that decade. Not because she was a slow learner, because that is simply how genuine transformation works. Think about what the entire show quietly demonstrates through her across all 10 years. Watch it as one continuous story, rather than 200 separate episodes. A woman handed an identity before she was old enough to question it. A woman who fled that identity in a moment of pure terror, with absolutely nothing prepared to replace it. A woman who spent a full decade building something real, slowly, clumsily, one humiliating job and one failed relationship at a time, until she finally had an identity that was fully her own. And then, crucially, a woman who got to choose freely what to do with that identity once she actually had it, not because someone else demanded it of her, not because circumstances forced her hand the way that wedding day once had, but because for the first time in her entire life, the decision genuinely belonged to her. And to nobody else. That is the real story hiding underneath the hair and the boyfriends, underneath the running joke about her early incompetence with something as simple as a paycheck. Rachel Green spent her whole life as someone other people decided things about. And somewhere across that long, messy, frequently hilarious decade, she became someone who finally got to decide things about herself instead. She spent her whole life being told she was a shoe. By the end, she had finally figured out she got to choose.